Hi, I'm Patrick. Today, I'm looking at amusement park trips that took a dark turn, where simple joyrides meant for fun ended in tragedy instead. From a waitress pushed into a half-repaired slide by someone she trusted, to a woman inside a haunted attraction, grabbing a live wire disguised as part of the set, ending the trip in the most horrifying way possible. It was August 12th, 2016, just outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. A storm had rolled through earlier that evening, leaving the water park empty. The concrete paths were wet, the rides shut down, and most of the lights switched off for the night. Dawn Trett, 24, worked as a waitress at a local restaurant where her co-workers remembered her as warm and easy to get along with. Her boyfriend, Daniel Sy, 28, had worked the night maintenance shift at the park for about 3 years. His job was fixing pumps, checking the seams on the slides, and walking the property after closing to make sure everything looked right. He had keys to different areas, access to ride controls, and knew the place so well that being there after hours probably didn't feel unusual anymore. Dawn had gone there with him before, so to her it likely just felt routine. That night, one of the steeper enclosed body slides had been out of service for several days. Guests had complained about rough scraping inside the tube earlier that week. Fiberglass patches had been applied along the interior, but the work wasn't finished. The patches hadn't been sanded smooth, leaving raised seams and hardened strips jutting inward along portions of the tunnel wall. The slide was fully drained, the pumps offline, and orange safety barriers placed at the entrance while repairs continued. Her boyfriend had an idea for a quick video. He wanted to film Dawn going down the slide, a short clip, something casual. He moved the barriers, convinced the steep opening drop would carry her through the tunnel even without water. 2 overnight maintenance workers across the midway later told investigators they saw him guiding Dawn toward the closed attraction, while a security employee making rounds nearby noticed the entrance barriers had been shifted aside. Witnesses later recalled him telling her to keep her arms tightly crossed before giving her a small push from the launch platform. She was still holding her phone when she went in. She was laughing. This guy's out of his mind. He worked in that tunnel, ran his hands over those rough, unfinished edges. He knew what was waiting in there, and still, he put her inside. She accelerated immediately. Without a water layer beneath her, she made direct contact with the dry slide floor. Her shoulder struck the first unfinished repair seam within seconds, tearing skin along her upper arm and spinning her sideways inside the dark, enclosed tunnel. The hardened patches scraped across her back, elbows, and legs as she continued down. Midway through, her hips struck a hardened repair strip near a tunnel joint, and her body rotated stomach first against the floor. By the final section, the repeated impacts had already thrown her partially sideways inside the tube. As the slide banked sharply left near the exit run, her upper body lifted slightly up the outer wall from the momentum before she lost balance again. A protruding repair flange left unfinished along the banked section caught the side of her head above her left ear as her body twisted back downward. The impact fractured her skull and caused catastrophic cervical spine injuries. She reached the runoff trough at the base with almost no momentum. Her boyfriend was still filming. He thought the sounds from inside the tunnel were excitement. When he reached the exit basin, Dawn was lying against the drain channel with heavy bleeding near her head and mouth. She was not moving. Overnight workers contacted emergency services. Investigators documented the unfinished fiberglass repairs, the disabled pumps, and the displaced safety barriers at the scene. Her boyfriend confirmed during questioning that he had moved the barriers himself. He was removed from his position and later faced local charges for bypassing restricted after-hours maintenance areas. The slide was permanently shut down. Co-workers later told investigators that workers had joked about riding drained slides after hours before, though none had ever actually attempted it on that attraction. Her death was ruled accidental. Unauthorized access to a closed attraction under active repair was identified as the primary contributing factor. Dawn gave all her trust to her boyfriend, but I guess she trusted the wrong person. The investigation found no mechanical failures. Everything that happened inside that tunnel was a direct result of a drained, half-repaired ride being used as a filming location after hours. The warnings were all in place. One decision undid them. The next case bothers me. A young woman is climbing out of a moving Ferris wheel cabin for a video, and her friends are egging her on from below. It was June 19th, 2015, and the county fairgrounds in Des Moines, Iowa, were lit up for one of the busiest nights of the season. Summer college classes had just wrapped up across the area. The weather was warm, and the midway was packed shoulder to shoulder with teenagers, families, and groups of friends moving between food stands, game booths, and rides. The Ferris wheel sat near the back of the fair, about 70 feet tall, slow rotating, glowing against the night sky. It was one of the tallest attractions on the lot, and from the upper cabins, you could see the entire fair stretched out below. Wylona Skiv was 19 years old. She worked as a cashier at a local grocery store and had a reputation among friends as the bold one in the group, and rarely backed down from a dare once it was thrown out in front of her. She had come to the fair that night with 3 friends, and the 4 of them had spent most of the evening daring each other into smaller and smaller stunts across the midway. One friend had already climbed over a ride fence earlier to pose beside a moving attraction. Another had tried to lean out of a swinging cabin on a different ride. What they did in that moving ride and the swinging was already a big red flag. I just don't get why anyone would go that far just to finish a dumb dare. Riders later told investigators that Wylona had been talking, loudly and more than once, about climbing from one gondola to the next while the wheel was moving. Her friends laughed at first, then they started pushing her on it. By the time their cabins lifted off the ground, the dare had become a challenge she didn't want to walk away from. The operator at the base was handling a lot, opening the gate, watching people move around in the cabins, and keeping an eye on the line, clearly too much for one person to keep up with. As the wheel carried her cabin upward, Wylona unclipped the safety chain across the gondola opening. The cabin rocked gently as she shifted her weight toward the outer rail. Witnesses in nearby gondolas said her friends were shouting up at her from below, egging her on, telling her she didn't actually have the nerve to do it. She climbed over the side rail near the upper section of the wheel, roughly 60 feet above the midway. One hand gripped the outer support bar. She stepped onto the narrow frame beside the gondola hinge and started reaching toward the neighboring cabin door. What she seemed to underestimate, and what riders later described, was how independently the cabins swayed once her weight shifted fully outside her own. Her original gondola tilted backward several inches the moment she committed to the reach. Her grip on the support beam slipped. For a brief second, her right hand caught the bar again, then it didn't. She fell from near the top of the wheel. During the descent, her lower body clipped the upper edge of a steel crowd barrier set up beside a food stand. The impact rotated her body before she hit the pavement near the midway entrance. Witnesses standing within 15 feet of the landing point described hearing a sharp crack when the back of her head struck the concrete. The ride was stopped moments later, but the damage was already done. Fair workers pushed the crowd back while paramedics fought their way through the midway to reach her. The fall had left injuries no one could survive. Her head, spine, and body all took the kind of hit that ends a life instantly. Officers spent the rest of the night interviewing the friends who had been in the gondolas around her. Several of them admitted to encouraging the climb. The Ferris wheel was inspected the next morning and reopened later that weekend. Investigators confirmed the ride had functioned normally and that the restraint chain had been manually unclipped from inside the cabin. Fair management later added louder pre-ride announcements, warning passengers to stay seated for the duration of the rotation. It's sad that sometimes the smallest decision we make for just a few seconds of attention can turn into something permanent before anyone even realizes the situation is out of control. The next story takes us to a family vacation, a packed water park, a 4-person raft, and a final turn that should have ended like every other ride that day. It was July 2017, and a regional amusement park near Branson was pushing through one of the hottest weekends of the summer. Temperatures stayed above 95 degrees. The water attractions had hour-long lines most of the day, and by closing time, the park's circular family raft ride was finally running shorter cycles as the crowds thinned out. That ride already had a bit of a reputation with the regulars. Earlier in the day, staff had to stop it for a while because a few rafts got stuck near the conveyor exit at the end. Some guests also pointed out that the heavier rafts seemed to tip harder when they hit the last turn. The crew gave it a quick check, adjusted the water flow so things would move more smoothly, and then started it back up again. The Vrail family had driven in from Arkansas for a weekend trip before the kids went back to school. Christian Vrail was 43, a delivery dispatcher who handled long shifts and didn't take many full weekends off. His wife handled bookkeeping for a small local business. Their two kids, Louis, 15, and his older sister Nathy, 16, had spent most of the day in the water park section, riding the bigger attractions over and over while their parents traded off in the shade. They picked the family raft ride near closing because the weight had finally dropped. All four of them climbed into the same tube. Louis had a small action camera strapped to his wrist and was filming parts of the climb up the lift hill. The operator gave the standard reminder to hold the inner handles firmly, and the raft was released into the course. I can imagine how happy the Vrail family must have been. With how busy life gets for working parents, it's rare to carve out real time for family bonding like this. The first half of the ride went normally. The trouble started as the raft entered the final turn basin, a wide circular section where the current carries the tube along an outer wall before guiding it toward the conveyor extraction channel. According to witnesses watching from the exit platform, the family's raft entered the basin spinning sideways, with most of the rider's weight shifted toward one side. The tube hit the outer concrete wall broadside at high speed. It rode up the curved wall briefly before tipping onto its side near the conveyor channel. Christian was on the side that struck the wall first. Witnesses said he hit the barrier head first and appeared dazed almost immediately, still gripping one of the handles. Within seconds, the raft overturned completely and wedged against the narrow conveyor divider. His wife was pinned briefly under one edge of the tube while trying to reach Louis underneath the water. Nathy was thrown partially clear of the raft, but struck the concrete basin wall shoulder first before falling back into the moving current. Witnesses on the platform saw Louis surface once near the edge of the overturned tube, then disappear underneath again as the circulating water pushed the raft sideways into the divider. Ride attendants hit the emergency stop, but the basin's circulating current and the position of the wedged raft kept it pinned against the wall. Several witnesses later said the raft stayed trapped long enough for rescuers to struggle getting a clear grip on it while water continued surging underneath. Christian, still dazed from the head impact, reportedly made little effort to swim clear, and Louis remained trapped in the turbulent pocket beneath the overturned tube for far longer than the initial panic on the platform made it seem. Several guests jumped into shallower sections to help, while lifeguards worked to drag the tube clear. By the time responders finally pulled the raft away, Christian was unresponsive from severe head trauma and prolonged near-drowning complications. Louis was recovered unconscious after being trapped underwater beneath the raft for an extended period and was later pronounced dead despite resuscitation efforts. His mother survived with serious internal injuries, and Nathy was treated for multiple fractures and a dislocated shoulder. The ride was closed for the rest of the season. Investigators focused on raft stability, the strength of the basin's circulating current, and the geometry of the conveyor extraction channel. Witness videos from the exit platform showed the raft tipping against the wall before overturning. The deaths were ruled the result of the raft overturning and the underwater entrapment near the conveyor divider. Major modifications were made to the basin flow controls and the exit channel before the ride was ever considered for reopening. I can't believe this went from family fun bonding to horrifying death real fast, and the only thing they did wrong was trust that the attraction was safe to ride. Up next is the kind of story where the bad calls start at the parking lot and don't stop until the ride pulls a man under a moving boat. It was September 2018, and the Boardwalk Amusement Park in Ocean City, Maryland, was running through its final weekend before slowing down for the off-season. The air was still warm, the bars along the boardwalk were packed, and the park itself was approaching its last full ride cycle of the night. The log flume, a long, family-friendly water ride with a dimly lit tunnel section before the final drop, was still running, though operators had started prepping for shutdown. Rob Prent was 29 and worked at an auto shop back home. Friends described him as loud, dependable, and usually the one keeping the group together. That weekend, he was celebrating his bachelor party with 6 close friends, and the night quickly escalated the way it often does for a group of late-20s friends reunited after years apart. By the time they reached the boardwalk, they had been drinking heavily for hours. Witnesses later described Rob as visibly intoxicated and easily the loudest person in the group. He'd been doing little stunts to keep his friends laughing, climbing on things he shouldn't, jumping where he shouldn't. The usual stuff that escalates when alcohol's involved. I think alcohol makes people feel invincible sometimes. Common sense disappears, and suddenly every dumb dare starts sounding funny instead of dangerous. The group rode the log flume once. Afterward, while standing near the exit area, Rob made a comment about being able to walk through the tunnel section before the next boat came around. His friends took the bait immediately. Phones came out. The dare was on. There was a maintenance gate beside the water channel, set off from the public path by a low fence and a few signs. Rob climbed over it. Park employees noticed almost right away and started shouting toward the group, but the people filming were leaning over the fencing themselves, and the noise of the ride drowned most of it out. Because the ride was still in its active clearing cycle, operators had not yet initiated the full shutdown lockout. One of the empty logs that had been dispatched to space the remaining boats was already moving through the tunnel behind him. He stepped down into the shallow flume channel. The concrete divider on the side was slick with algae, and within the first few feet, he slipped once and caught himself against the wall. He didn't stop. Witnesses later said he kept going deeper into the tunnel, balancing one hand against the wall as he moved. The flume was still cycling empty boats intermittently. Operators had not yet begun the full shutdown sequence, which meant the conveyor was still active and a log was already moving through the tunnel from behind him. Inside the tunnel, the channel narrows sharply near a concrete support beam, roughly halfway through. That's where Rob was when the boat came up behind him. He tried to flatten himself against the wall as the log approached. The ride noise and echoing water masked most of his shouting. He lost his footing on the wet surface and fell sideways into the narrow gap between the wall and the incoming boat. The front edge of the log pinned his torso against the concrete. The conveyor tires beneath the boat kept pushing forward. Riders seated in another log further back in the system felt the collision and started yelling for the operators to stop the ride. The emergency stop engaged seconds later, but the boat had already moved forward against him for several feet. Responders reached him inside the tunnel and found him trapped upright between the log and the wall. Injuries included massive chest compression trauma, pelvic fractures, and internal bleeding consistent with sustained entrapment pressure. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Park operators drained part of the flume channel overnight to recover the boat and document the scene. Witness statements and the videos his friends had filmed were all submitted as evidence. Investigators confirmed Rob had willingly entered a restricted, active ride area while heavily intoxicated. The attraction reopened several days later after inspections of the conveyor and emergency stop systems, and additional fencing and signage were installed around the tunnel entrance. Investigators determined that unauthorized entry into an active ride area was the primary cause of his death. If I were one of his friends, I definitely wouldn't just stand behind the fence. I'd step in right away the moment I felt there was danger, because to me that's what being a friend is, looking out for each other. Where we're headed next. The warning signs weren't on a fence at all. They were on a prosthetic leg, sitting 2 rows behind a woman who never saw it coming. It was March 2015, and an indoor amusement center near Reno, Nevada was running at full capacity for a Saturday night. The place was the kind of mid-sized indoor venue you find tucked into the corner of a strip mall. Compact roller coasters, simulator rides, arcade machines, and a small food court along the back wall. Lena Blux was 33 years old. She worked as an office administrator at a local company, and her co-workers were celebrating one of their birthdays that night at the amusement center. From everything her co-workers later shared, Lena was the steady, quiet one in the group, the kind of person who showed up to every birthday and every after-work dinner without ever making it about her. She had been talked into the indoor coaster by 2 co-workers seated beside her in the front car. A few rows behind them, a man in his 60s was also being seated. He was a retired military veteran wearing a carbon fiber below-knee prosthetic. The locking pin system on the device was older, and the strap harness around the upper attachment had visible wear. He had mentioned to people standing in line earlier that the prosthetic occasionally loosened during sudden movement. He had also been adjusting the lower leg connection repeatedly while seated, twisting one of the securing straps near the knee in the process. The operator went through the same routine they did with every group. He checks the restraints, giving the standard safety reminders and telling riders to hold on to their loose belongings. The prosthetic never raised any concern. There weren't really any rules or checks for something like unsecured medical equipment, and from where the operator was standing, it probably just blended in like part of the rider's clothing or shoe beneath the harness. It's hard to believe that the same device that lets a person function in everyday life could become part of what makes a ride unsafe. The coaster launched into a steep indoor drop almost immediately after leaving the station, surrounded by flashing strobe effects and heavy music. Witnesses described the first sequence as a sharp banked turn, followed by a fast right-hand pull, then another sudden left. Internal ride cameras later showed the prosthetic shifting outward from its attachment during the second high-speed turn. The locking pin had already begun to fail. Midway through the ride, during a sharp left-hand bank, the lower leg assembly detached completely. The detached carbon fiber piece traveled across several rows of riders. It struck Lena along the right side of her face and eye socket. Witnesses in the cars around her said the impact was sudden and loud enough to be heard over the music. The blow appeared to stun and partially incapacitate her immediately, leaving her disoriented and slumped sideways against the restraint. The two co-workers seated beside her later told investigators she didn't make a sound after the hit. Seconds later, the coaster entered another sudden high-speed turn. The force of the banked maneuver whipped her upper body harder into the steel shoulder restraint, while she was still unable to properly brace or recover from the first strike. Investigators later determined that this secondary collision, amplified by the coaster's speed and lateral force, caused the catastrophic head and neck injuries that proved fatal. The prosthetic itself, which had ricocheted off the restraint frame, settled near the floor of the ride vehicle. She remained slumped in her seat for the rest of the cycle. Blood became visible near her eye and ear before the coaster returned to the unloading station. Ride operators initially thought she had become motion sick or passed out from the ride itself. It wasn't until the riders around her began shouting for help that the severity registered. She was pronounced dead a short time after arriving at a nearby hospital. The coaster was shut down while investigators reviewed the onboard footage and the prosthetic. The retired veteran cooperated fully and admitted he had not told staff how unstable the locking mechanism had recently become. The amusement center later updated its rider screening procedures to address unsecured medical devices, loose wearable equipment, and similar items not previously flagged in standard checks. Lena's co-workers were interviewed because several of them had recorded portions of the ride before the incident. Footage from inside the train confirmed the moment of detachment and the secondary impact against the restraint hardware. Her death was ruled fatal cranial trauma and catastrophic cervical spine injuries caused primarily by the secondary collision after the initial impact left her unable to brace. For me, what happened to Lena shows how even the smallest oversight can cost a life. Safety isn't just about the ride itself. It's about everything people bring with them, and that has to be checked carefully every single time. Coming up after this, danger isn't a person or a piece of equipment at all. It's a wire, left hanging in a hallway, dressed up as part of the show. It was October 2017, and a seasonal haunted attraction outside Akron, Ohio, was running through one of its busiest weekends of the Halloween season. The venue was a temporary setup inside a rented warehouse. Concrete floors, exposed beams, fog machines pumping non-stop, strobes flashing through almost every corridor, and recorded screams playing on a loop from speakers overhead. One section of the maze was a narrow corridor lined with hanging corpse props. Earlier that afternoon, maintenance workers had replaced damaged lighting equipment there after repeated electrical failures. A temporary 120-volt cable was mounted overhead, to keep the hallway partially lit, but part of its insulation had torn away, exposing copper underneath. Workers had originally secured the damaged section higher above the props, partially hidden within the set dressing. But as crowds moved through the corridor that night, the loose cable gradually shifted lower into reach. Under the fog and flashing strobes, the exposed wire blended in with the rest of the decorations. Kiana Glint was 22 years old. She worked in retail at a local store and had come to the haunted attraction with several co-workers as a Halloween night out. The people closest to her described her as the kind of person who leaned into everything. Loud reactions, big laughs, jumpy at the first scare, and recovering with a joke 5 seconds later. She was the one in the group who actually wanted to be there. The rest of them were mostly along for the ride. Her group had been filming reaction videos on their phones through every section of the maze. By the time they reached the hanging corridor, they had already grabbed at props in earlier rooms, which witnesses said was common throughout the night. Most guests pushed, swatted, or reached for the dangling decorations as they passed. The fog had thickened in that hallway, and the floor was damp from the moisture buildup. The suspended cables and props above were damp as well. So were Kiana's hands. Haunted attractions already make it hard to tell what's real and what's part of the performance. Between the fog, flashing lights, loud audio, and actors jumping out at random, people tend to lower their guard around anything that looks like part of the set. I don't know about you, but horror houses always get to me. Even before stepping inside, I feel my chest tighten because I know I'll jump at every scare. I'm curious, what's your own experience with haunted attractions? She reached upward toward one of the hanging objects while laughing with the people behind her. What her hand closed around wasn't a prop. It was the exposed section of the temporary lighting cable. The current locked her grip around the copper almost instantly. Witnesses nearby said they heard a sharp popping sound, followed by the overhead lights in that section flickering. Her body jerked against the contact for several seconds. The strobes were still firing, the recorded screams were still playing, and the people directly behind her in the corridor initially thought her reaction was part of the show. A few of them laughed. One of her co-workers later told investigators it took her a moment to realize Kiana wasn't moving the way someone playing along would move. Eventually, her body weight pulled the unsecured cable loose from its temporary mount above the corridor. The contact broke, and she fell backward onto the concrete floor. The back of her head struck the ground hard. Blood became visible almost immediately near the wall beneath the hanging props. Staff members rushed into the hallway after smoke became visible near the damaged section of ceiling wiring. By the time they reached her and pushed through the surrounding guests, paramedics had already been called. Responders later documented electrical burns across her palm and forearm, along with severe head trauma from the backward fall. The head injury was identified as the fatal one. The current itself was strong enough to incapacitate her, but not immediately lethal. The concrete was what ended it. The attraction was evacuated shortly after emergency crews arrived. Investigators traced the live wire back to the temporary lighting repairs performed earlier that day. Employees confirmed the damaged cable had been left hanging in place until replacement equipment arrived, with no barrier and no signage marking it as live. Local officials cited unsafe maintenance practices directly tied to the setup of the attraction. The haunted house remained closed for the rest of the Halloween season. Kiana's death was caused by contact with exposed electrical wiring and a fatal secondary fall onto concrete. For me, Kiana's death really came down to negligence. The owners left a live electrical wire hanging in a fog-filled hallway, with no warnings or barriers at all, and that makes it unforgivable.